Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the government is publishing the first in a series of papers advising people and businesses on how to get ready and prepare for the UK leaving the European Union without a negotiated agreement next March, of course. The Brexit Secretary, Dominic Raab, says the plans will help to ensure the smooth continued functioning of the UK economy. About 70 so-called technical notices will be issued during the next few weeks, covering sectors including farming, transport and medicine as well. Ministers insist they're confident of securing a Brexit deal, though. Here's our political correspondent, Jonathan Blake.
As well as summer holidays, government ministers have been away on business over the last few weeks, touring the capitals of Europe to talk up their plan for Brexit. The agreement reached weeks ago by the cabinet at Chequers has not been warmly welcomed by officials in Brussels, which has meant more talk about the possibility of Britain leaving the EU without a deal.
It does mean disruption to trade as we know it, and as a consequence of that, a disruption to the level of economic activity.
It makes sense to put those preparations in place for no deal because we're in a negotiation. So we're taking sensible precautions, we're taking sensible measures, but we're working hard to get a good deal.
Hospitals and ambulance services have warned of a possible shortage of supplies. Farms could be on the brink of collapse, according to the National Farmers Union, and a committee of MPs said no deal would be a disaster for the UK's food and drink industry. The Brexit Secretary Dominic Raab says the government's technical notices will tackle what he's called hair-raising scare stories. Here at Westminster, talk of leaving the EU without a deal is a sensitive subject. Some see it as no bad thing. For others, it's the worst of all worlds. Everyone, though, will be looking closely to see how the government has decided people should prepare. As the deadline for departure looms, what life could be like outside the EU without a Brexit deal is about to become a little clearer. Jonathan Blake, BBC News.
Our political correspondent Ian Watson is in Westminster now. Morning to you, Ian. Apparently Dominic Raab's going to talk about doing something unilaterally today. What does he mean by that?
Well, that's right, Matt. He's making a speech, the Brexit Secretary, around 11 o'clock this morning, setting out the government's approach. And part of that approach, he'd say, in the event of no deal, would be for Britain to take what he calls unilateral action, which sounds pretty robust and tough, doesn't it? But I think what it actually means is that Britain would have, in effect, no choice but to continue to follow EU rules in many areas voluntarily immediately after Brexit, then, in his words, diverge from the European Union when we are ready. So I think that approach might actually come as something of disappointment to some people who campaigned to leave the EU. In other areas, I think it's about the government stepping in. So, for example, the government making subsidies available to the farming industry, which otherwise would currently come from Brussels. But he does have quite a difficult task because, on the one hand, he has to try to tell people, as he will in his speech this morning, that he thinks a good deal is within sight, but also reassure businesses in particular that the government has been doing enough planning if everything goes wrong and that it is prepared for that type of outcomes. And in order to try to convince them that that's the case, there'll be a whole range of things which is going to be covering everything from organic food production, believe it or not, to the financial services industry. 25 different papers, of course, outlining what the government might do in the event of no deal. And he was trying to reassure people when he spoke to the BBC this morning by saying, for example, when it comes to medicines, blood supplies, we are largely self-sufficient when it comes to blood, he said, and also in order to continue to do business on current terms inside the EU, banks, for example, could set up subsidiaries so they wouldn't be cut out of the financial markets. And we're going to get a lot more of that technical detail in a couple of hours' time.
Quite a bit more to read. Thanks very much indeed, Ian. We'll be discussing it more as well on the show very shortly. Just last week, the Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, said in an interview that the UK leaving the European Union with no deal would be a huge geostrategic mistake that we would regret for generations. But despite such ominous warnings, the government is today publishing the first batch of its no-deal impact papers, which will tell businesses and everyone else what to do in the event of the UK crashing out of the EU with no deal, if indeed that's how you feel about no deal. Ministers insist the so-called technical notices covering issues including farming, financial services, medicine and other things are just part of the planning for every eventuality. We'll be looking at some of these areas later on in the programme, but first let's look at the likelihood of securing a deal in the next 6 months. Joining me now are David Henning, UK Director of the European Centre for International Political Economy and a former EU negotiator. Also, Jonathan Liss, Deputy Director of the think tank British Influence, which champions the UK working closely with Europe, and Georgina Wright from the Europe Programme at the Independent Policy Institute, Chatham House. Good morning to you all. David, you're a former EU negotiator. Why is the government putting out these no-deal, well, they feel like warnings, no-deal preparation papers, I guess?
It is part of the preparation the government should be doing, but I think it's more about the state of the Conservative Party than the state of the negotiations. There's already plenty of information that the EU has provided pretty clearly about what no deal means. This is going to be the UK equivalent. It'll show that they are thinking about it, but I don't think it's a serious negotiating move. I think it's more to say to the Conservative Party, look, we are preparing for every eventuality. We're not going to have any deal at any price.
Jonathan, is this, do you think, part of the deal process, looking like we're possibly getting ready for not having a deal to try and G things along a bit?
I mean, it's a bit like a person holding a gun to his head and saying, do you think I'm crazy enough to do this? And sort of issuing a series of notices for what happens if he actually does do it. It is that crazy to even think about doing this. First of all, if you were planning to leave without a deal, you should have issued these notices 2 years ago before you even triggered Article 50. But at this far in the process, nobody believes that we're actually going to do this. And even if the Prime Minister or her successor did plan to do this, there'd be uproar because it would have to be sort of laid in place after December, where the negotiations are broken down. The economy would start to collapse. Public opinion would turn against it. MPs would vote against it. No deal is not going to happen. It's pointless for the government to do this. It's not going to happen. It's wasting energy that could be expended elsewhere on actually getting a deal.
Georgina, how do you feel? It could happen. This could be wise on the part of the government to say, if it does happen, this is how you should prepare. On the other hand, some people think if you're given a safety net, you're inclined to use it.
I mean, I'm with Jonathan on this point. I think a no deal is really unlikely. I think the political stakes are far too high. And also, if you imagine, no deal happening, the UK crashing out of the EU with no deal, at some point, the EU and the UK are going to have to come back to the negotiating table. They're going to have to talk to each other. What is it going to do for political trust? It's going to squander any lingering goodwill between them, and it would make the atmosphere even more acrimonious. And I just don't think it's a price that's worth paying.
Theresa May thinks it's an even worse price to pay for a bad deal. No deal is better than a bad deal, she says.
Yeah, I mean, then it's up to you to kind of make that planning and look at it. And from a strategic point of view, it doesn't really make much sense. We don't. Obviously, economic repercussions are hard to quantify, but there would be severe disruption. And any disruption to trade inevitably means that it's going to become less efficient, it will become more costly for producers, and those prices are usually borne by consumers. So there's that. But then I also think politically, look at it. The UK government said, we want a deal. The EU have said they want a deal. And I think the recent press conference between Dominic Raab and Michel Barnier showed that that's what they're going to be doing.
Yeah, let's just talk about Dominic Raab, Jonathan. Fairly new in the job. Seems to be quite invigorated, actually. He's got a bit more energy than perhaps his predecessor, David Davis. Hang on, why are you laughing at that?
Well, yes, he's due to go there again next week. That'll be 3 times in a few weeks.
Is he just like European jollies? Do you think that's what it is? He just likes hopping on the Eurostar.
No, that's what you've got to do in a negotiation, is you've got to put in the FaceTime.
And David Davis
huge
just
mistake.
But Dominic Raab is not in control of this show. So Dominic Raab...
Who is? Michel Barnier?
Well, obviously Michel Barnier is in charge of it overall because the EU has so much more power than the UK. But Theresa May and Ollie Robbins, her kind of Sherpa, as it's called, is running this show. And what this really is about blackmailing the public and about blackmailing politicians. They want to scare people with these no-deal...
So this is Project Fear?
It's Project Fear from the government. government, exactly. The government wants to scare us, manipulate us, blackmail us into thinking these terrible things are going to happen, so people run into the arms of a deal that Theresa May strikes. That's what it's about, because they think no deal is so terrible, any deal has to be better than that.
That's the Remainer point of view, David.
Yes.
But the opposite to that is there's plenty of Brexiteers and plenty in Parliament who think no deal is the best deal. Us working on World Trade Organization rules, because let's not forget, plenty of countries don't have official deals with the European Union, but they still do business with them.
They do business, but there are agreements that sit above the World Trade Organization rules.
Yeah.
And that's the point that a lot of people have been making, myself included, is WTO rules only is really a bad deal. You're paying quite high tariffs, you've got all manner of barriers in place to sending goods abroad and to providing services.
What? Bureaucracy, paperwork,
lots
just
of
time-consuming stuff.
extra paperwork, essentially.
Yeah.
And that actually, when we talk about WTO rules, very few countries actually trade with each other just on WTO rules. There are huge numbers of agreements, and that even if we can't do a full all-singing, all-dancing deal, we still should have those deals in place, and that international negotiations take time. I think this is the big thing that's missing in all of this. You know, to just go out in March, 6 months, you don't create international agreements in 6 months.
No, they do take time, and certainly we've seen the deal that Canada has done with the European Union has taken years. How many? 7 years, something like that. But the difference is Britain is already part of the EU, or is at the moment, so our rules are already aligned with the European Union. It shouldn't be that hard, certainly on the trade element of this. So what else is holding it up? Ireland, Gibraltar, that kind of thing?
I think, you know, there's a point to be made about trade agreements. When you're striking a trade agreement, negotiating a trade agreement, you're trying to bring those barriers down. Now, at the moment, we have the closest kind of form of integration, and basically we are talking about possibly putting new barriers in. And, you know, it's not just about having similar rules, as David said. It's, you know, similar rules helps, but you still have lots of paperwork. So if, you know, you're a British company and you're exporting to the EU, all of a sudden you're going to have to, you know, fill in paperwork to prove that your products meet those standards. You're going to have checks at the borders, and all of those things actually take time. And, you know, at the moment we don't have to deal with that.
But arguably more serious than that is the idea that we might not have enough medicine coming in. So this isn't just a trade thing, a bit of a shock to the economy. This could mean life or death for some people.
WTO is not just about trade. I mean, well, the WTO is about trade, rather, but no-deal Brexit isn't just about trade. It's about all kinds of things. It's about aviation, for example. It's about medicines, as we were saying. So the medicines come through the border. If the border gets clogged because the French are checking every single lorry that goes from our side over there, that means that insulin and radioisotopes will simply become useless at the border, and the food will rot.
The NHS is starting to stockpile in preparation for a no-deal, which is what this is all about.
There are certain things you can't stockpile. You know, we don't produce our insulin, we import our radioisotopes for radiotherapy. These are things that we can't do. The government is not all-powerful. There are some things the government can manage, there are some things the government simply won't be able to do.
We're talking a lot about ifs, buts and maybes, OK? Because, like you say, depending on your point of view, this could be perceived as project fear, or this could be perceived as just sensible planning for the inevitable. Let's just finish off with the three of you saying what you absolutely think will be happening in March next year. And we haven't even got on to the idea that there's been a time limit on this from the moment Article 50 was triggered. But what will happen, do you think, David, in March?
I think we're going to move into a transitional period where more or less it looks like the same as we have now, except we're no longer members of the EU, and then we will go into a long period of negotiations with the EU about the future.
Indefinite period.
Potentially.
Yeah, Jonathan?
I think that we will probably get to the brink some point towards the end of this year, and I think that there'll be a real momentum for a new vote when people see what the options are. But if there isn't a new vote, then we'll have a deal, and then we'll have a transition period which will last for a long time.
Any GCSE student will tell you that when the deadline is approaching, then you start to work just a bit harder, don't you? Funnily enough. Georgina, what's your view? Where do you think we'll be at in March next year and beyond?
I mean, you know, it's worth remembering Brexit is a political process, but it's also a very legal and technical process. If we think discussions so far have been complicated, let's wait until discussions about the future begin, because that's going to be a whole new story.
Really give us just a little flavour of that, just to entice us?
You know, I mean, again, on the EU side, you know, different member states are going to be impacted differently by the UK's withdrawal, and they're going to have, you know, different priorities. There's going to be lots of internal negotiations, and then that makes the EU much more inflexible, actually, because it's going to say, well, our position is now, you know, the outcome of compromise. How much can we actually budge to meet the UK's, demands. It will, we'll see. It's
Sure.
gonna be interesting.
What we haven't touched upon is if the UK does do well out of this, as plenty of Brexiteers will tell you, that it might entice some of the other 27 to think along those lines too.
Absolutely.
We'll talk about that another time, Jonathan, I think. Thank you all very much indeed.